Hi, my name is Catherine Schulstrom, and I will be covering the recreational marijuana legalization political issue in the United States. For centuries, marijuana has been grown and cultivated into a major crop that's been essential for food, insulation, and a lot more. Before the era where plastic and fiberglass came into play, the crop's fibers were largely responsible for the thriving of civilizations before modern America. In America today, the federal government has caused great interference with state legislation, and for this particular issue, legalizing recreational marijuana at the state level has many implications, as the 10th Amendment, 5th Amendment, and the Controlled Substances Act have been interpreted in different ways that strongly affect state power limitations. It can also be argued that this is one of the most important generational federalism issues that has taken place since the last century. Exactly how much power of regulation should the states have while making laws, especially drug legalization like marijuana? To what extent should the federal government be constitutionally and fairly able to interfere with regulation in accordance with subjects such as the Supremacy Clause? And finally, how does the difference between interstate and intrastate commerce affect the ability to regulate at the federal level? With America backed with the war on drugs and many harsh laws passed to strictly regulate illicit drugs, many argue out of fear against the legalization of marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance. Should fear, both valid and not, potentially about how potentially dangerous the drug is, be our singular basis to have it banned on the state level? In this complex political issue, we will begin to investigate how the history of marijuana, along with America's racist history, potentially affects how the country responds to drug use today and how strict laws have gotten passed over the years. My goal here is to present factual information about laws passed in an attempt to control marijuana, cover the background it had at a federal level through the 1900s, and to provide details over the extensive arguments of pro and anti-legalization, myself strongly supporting the valid argument to legalize. Moving into our background information, I find it crucial to understand the history of how marijuana came about to be used so widespread in medicinal and practical usage, and as well as to compare it to how different the government stances have been since the 1900s. As mentioned in my intro, it was widely used for textiles and was a crucial import, being a staple crop and normalized for all sorts of healing modalities. Moving forward to closer times, it came through Mexican immigrants looking for work in the 1900s. Right after, the Harrison Act of 1914 was the federal government's first attempt to outlaw hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, and other drugs. However, all they could do was tax these drugs, as it was unconstitutional at the time to ban narcotics, which the states had greater power at the time, according to the 10th Amendment. For greater context, although these drugs were highly regulated, widespread use of marijuana in particular hadn't occurred until the Prohibition era, which started in the 1920s. It was thought of at the time that minorities were influencing this heavily with the widespread wave of illicit drugs that were coming in at the time. To the federal government, however, they also included marijuana as a highly dangerous drug that could be comparable to cocaine, and they did all that they could to regulate it as such. The issue here is there wasn't enough info to get a grasp on the safety of the drug, so it almost seemed like they ignored the past medicinal quality it contained as well. Regardless, around this time in the 30s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was organized, and the director at this time, who was named Harry Anslinger, made it a point to scare citizens with racist notions to back his points. They framed not only Mexicans, but a lot of the Asian population as well, deeming them as quote unquote Chinamen who seduce white women with drugs. Overall, this was pretty much their only tactic to place control on people's attitudes from marijuana at the time, which to me seems pretty weak, but was a very influential way of doing things at the time, the whole tactic of scaring. This also got me thinking about how the same inner hatred towards minorities might extend to unfair prosecution in current times. I think the history most definitely repeats itself. As stated by the American Civil Liberties Union, Black people are 3.64 times more likely than those who are white to be arrested for marijuana possession, and in some states, minority groups are 8, 9, and 10 more likely to be under arrest. Personally, I can see that these attitudes towards drugs, such as marijuana, have turned into a wide systemic issue, as those who oppose legalization may be thinking that our country is letting these minorities win at placing a certain danger in our society in some cases. What's funny is, though, to me, white people use this drug just as much as any of the rest of the population anyways, if not even more frequently. So now we're going to move forward to the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act of 1937, which placed all marijuana holders of any kind to be required to show a tax stamp. When it was finally declared unconstitutional in 1969, it was realized that the need for a tax stamp means that self-incrimination, which goes against the Fifth Amendment. So this act means that no way it would work for recreational marijuana possession, but only medicinal. But to the crucial part, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed all interstate commerce authority into the federal government's hands. So this is where it gets important. So now this makes it extra tricky for how to fairly regulate this kind of marijuana specifically. Our first look at seeing how much power the federal government should have when states should legalize, will start legalizing marijuana, is the Commerce Clause, which is located in Article 1 of the Constitution. This gives Congress authority to regulate interstate commerce that goes between and crosses state lines. However, running into a barrier, this does not allow regulation of intrastate commerce, which occurs within state borders solely. And digging a little bit deeper than this, the necessary and proper clause gives leeway for Congress to add any additional laws on top of pretty much any legislation that they would like, that they think is necessary and proper. And in my paper, I mentioned the case of Gonzalez versus Rake, which is a great example of how the government has used this in order to gain more control over state regulation. This case involved a small amount of personal marijuana grown in California. Both sides categorized it as intrastate commerce, as it was both personally kept and localized. But in an argument to federally regulate this, the court mentioned this portion of it. According to Brian Blumenfield, who wrote a historico-constitutional primer on state legalization, it states that, quote unquote, the extension of federal regulatory authority to interstate commerce is constitutional if the interstate activity belongs to a class of activities that could have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. So to them, even personal use was considered to have a somewhat strong effect on supply and demand that by extension led into the interstate commerce. And so they thought that this was fair to be regulated at the time. So the last detail that can give states considerable options when legalizing such a drug is the anti-commandeering clause, which stops the feds from requiring states to assist in any national law enforcement at all. So basically, if a state wishes to not enforce charges for a drug such as marijuana in this case, then they technically do not have to take any action to do so. Although this does make the federal government still able to interfere. First of all, this doesn't happen very much, and they don't have the resources to do so because they rely on a lot of the states to control much of the illicit drug regulation. So if they really did want to come and regulate it all, it would just be a big waste of time and money in the long run and just would not be worth it. So as an example, the state of Colorado used this as a great argument, stating that if they removed all marijuana laws, activity would dramatically increase and would sweep across its borders and cause strain on the extension of interstate commerce, which is what the federal government want to control and can control. But with their current regulations and laws, they argue that it would cause much less conflict at the federal level and keep activity mild but underway. This would allow the government to do way less work at regulating and save time and money in the long run. Since this time, other states such as Washington and New York have come up with similar arguments, and the spread of legalization is beginning at a more rapid pace. So now moving on to my analysis, and that we have, since we have a strong background on how marijuana came to be regulated, it's time to progress into public perceptions of pro and anti-legalization, as highlighted by Emma McGinty and others. In this article, a public opinion survey was conducted to measure the strength of pro and anti-legalization arguments that were used in debates and elsewhere to see how the strength correlates with support for pro-legalization. So they took in mind to see the strength of individuals in states that had been legalized versus individuals that lived in states that hadn't been legalized yet. So they also took in political affiliation as well, so Democrat, Republican, and Independent. This was a web-based survey that offered small financial awards, and 4 million US adults ended up opting into this. The content of these questions is sourced from US print, news media, and many other political debates to see how good these questions could be formulated. The first pro-legalization argument was in favor of health and safety outcomes. According to the survey, 31% of adults in favor of legalization thought that a beneficial health consequence would be that legalization could reduce prescription opioid overdose, which is a serious issue in the US, where opioid dependency has been soaring for decades. If marijuana of all kinds is legalized, this could save considerable health costs in the long run for those addicted to opiates and who are also dependent on them. And going hand in hand with this argument is that legalization could potentially save many people from ingesting dangerous compounds within cannabis products. If it was legalized, purchasers would know that they are getting safe products as a guarantee without any issues along the way. However, anti-legalization arguments against this that were highlighted by the Journal of Global Drug Policy and Practice claim that inevitably the increase in use would correspond to an upgrade in abuse and dependence issues at a larger scale. So let's say like the users would be between 13 million and 47 million, then treatment admissions would likely increase from 1.3 million all the way to 4 million and cause like way more health costs. So the estimates could be around 11 billion annually. However, I strongly disagree that healthcare treatment would rise at such an extensive length, as marijuana is known to have less than a 9% dependency rate of any kind, doesn't matter, psychological or physical, which is very unlikely for anyone to have any kind of health risk unless they were a chronic user. And even in that circumstance, most people don't need any treatment at all. So considering legalization, it wouldn't cause every single American to start using it, whether it be if you're a new or old user, so potential for abuse would still be low. And like I said, it wouldn't be serious enough to require like a lot of healthcare funds and the like. So although most of these adults who agreed to this argument lived in legalized states, there was only about a 6% difference of those agreeing to this exact statement that lived in non-legalized states. So there's not a huge difference there that we can notice. Let's see. So another one of the highest voted arguments with 63% of adults agreeing to is increased tax revenue that, if in place, would increase revenue by as much as $6 million. Taxation, licensing, and industry in culmination could generate more than 8.7 billion in revenue, but the exact value can't be seen since obviously industry can vary by state. However, this being said, I think this would be an excellent incentive to legalize. More money flow never hurt anyone. And going hand in hand with finances, legalizing recreational marijuana would create a booming new industry that could be up to 14 billion each year potentially. However, some arguments that go against this state that it could potentially become a corrupt company such as the tobacco industry that can be used as a model, advertising very severe health risks to a large number of consumers like they did. However, I do believe that this risk is very low, as marijuana doesn't contain the amount of health concerns as tobacco, which is a very harmful drug, has, such as serious lung damage. So if the industry grew, it would definitely attract more customers and a wide variety of individuals, but I really do not think it would cause any kind of medium or large health epidemic as the tobacco companies had done before and were sued against. So the last major viewpoint I'd like to add to the pro-legalization arguments is the criminal justice and budgetary impacts legalizing would take into place. If recreational marijuana were to be legalized nationwide, prison overcrowding would decrease significantly, with 62% of adults in the survey agreeing with this. According to the FBI, the number of incarcerated Americans for drug crimes jumped from around 41,000 in the 80s to approximately over 800,000 in 2009. Now, this is like a very huge jump, and more than half, so approximately 52% of all drug arrests that occur now are all marijuana related. With this in mind, I thought that if cannabis were even more decriminalized today in other states, this could potentially put an end to imprisonment of nonviolent drug users, regardless of it being a marijuana charge or not. In terms of other drug cases, sentencing could be shorter, and it could have more options available than just continuous imprisonment, which could save a lot of money in the long run towards funding prisons. I also think this would cut down on budget expenditures, meaning much less money would have to go into law enforcement, which would be great. I think an absurd amount of people get pulled over and or arrested for small amounts of marijuana on them that I know of. And I think that if law enforcement spent less time focusing on this, they could focus on more important matters at hand. So the other justice matter at hand, I think, is the potential for racial disparities to decrease. 39% of adults from the survey agree. I do think that over time, this could decrease unfair treatment of minorities, most especially in drug prosecution. However, as this is a huge systemic issue, I can't see this being fixed over a short period of time, but I think that in the long run, that we could potentially look at something like this issue a lot more closely to see how much has changed. So on to the anti-legalization arguments. So other than that was what was previously stated, 51% of respondents agreed that legalizing marijuana could lead to increased motor vehicle crashes. This one is one of the only arguments I can agree with, as just like alcohol, cannabis makes it more difficult to drive. Although it isn't the same exact type of influence, it can impair someone's senses similarly, even though it is slightly less dangerous. Regardless, it would be an extra expense to promote safe driving, much like it has done for alcohol awareness, which would be expensive, but effective in the long run with preventing such driving. Tying it back to healthcare costs, this could also potentially raise these as well. However, not nearly as much as the projected $11 million+ for healthcare costs. From the other argument. Another opposing argument is that legalizing marijuana would not eliminate the black market. Although I agree with this, either legalizing or not legalizing would definitely not eliminate the black market to begin with. And if anything, I think that legalizing would reduce higher cartel success in controlling the market more heavily, which is another argument that was listed in this survey source with an agreement rate of 47%. If there's a greater legal market with many companies competing against each other with recreational cannabis, this gives a lot less money to illicit sellers, as the rate of product sales would go rapidly up for legal companies. Regardless of this, the black market is still something to consider when looking into these arguments, and I do believe that it is still valid, as it is a serious issue, but I don't think it has much like validity in this for this particular argument. So the most accurate argument, in my opinion, to legalize recreational marijuana realistically is that the tax revenue increases at the state level, as well as the criminal justice arguments that savings would be in play on the law enforcement level with lower arrests and imprisonments on marijuana charges, as well as racial prejudice disparities along with that. Although much of this would be long-term and not short-term, since our justice system is flawed and over-biased, and is unfair against minorities regardless of the charge against them, I think that most of these arguments towards criminal justice are the most valid in this case. And tying this back to my background information that I provided, It is clear that there was much racial bias even in the early days of drug legislation, and since then it's only been extended upon. I agree that this would be a strong foot forward for change. If no one can be prosecuted for quantities of marijuana at the state level, this including minorities, everyone's happier. In brief, the reasons for legalizing recreational marijuana outweigh the cons for doing so. I strongly agree with the affirmative reasons to legalize, such as possible decreases in healthcare costs due to somewhat lesser use of opiates. And although we are speaking about recreational and not medicinal, I still believe that the right buyers that primarily use it for recreational reasons could still benefit from it, from anything from pain management to any other health conditions, regardless if they have a serious condition or not, which medical marijuana could give way into. I'm a strong supporter of alternative healing modalities, so I could see the impact of this if marijuana was legalized nationwide. I also strongly agree with how much state revenue can be collected from companies, creating an abundance of wealth, along with a more closely knit law enforcement budget that could create and save a lot of money in the long run. By far, my greatest reason to support legalization is much lower incarceration rates and more fair and reasonable treatment for all, regardless of the drug charge or upcoming drug charge, most especially related to marijuana. If anything, legalizing marijuana could unite more people together. Also, considering this issue is a federalism issue, I took longer to explain the background as the federal government has much to figure out and negotiate in terms of letting states legalize cannabis on their own terms. Although they do not have constitutional reasons to regulate it, still, in this sense, states should not be afraid to legalize it like many others already have. Change is always good. So in terms of my own recommendations for solving this political issue, I would recommend first to decriminalize marijuana altogether nationwide, besides just in a few states before legalizing it in all states. Many states have already done this, and I think this would be an amazing first step at fixing our justice system, since cannabis is a very common drug along with alcohol. I also would recommend doing more research from statistical teams to see how accurate projections could be in terms of increase in revenue, savings from law enforcement, and more. Although this would not fix the issue, it would aid in more potential votes to legalize it. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And here are my sources listed.